Zoom. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Aimi Hamraie. Aimi is an associate professor of medicine, health and society and American studies at Vanderbilt University and director of the Critical Design Lab. They are the author of Building Access, Universal Design and, The Politics of Disability, published in 2017. Their next book, Enlivened City, examines the aspiration toward livable cities through frameworks from critical disability studies and science and technology studies. Hamraie is also host of the Contra Asterisk podcast on disability design justice. They are also a recent appointee for the U.S. Access Board. Thank you so much for joining us. We'd also like to thank Catherine D'Ignazio, Assistant Professor of Urban Science and Planning at MIT, for facilitating today's conversation.
Thanks, Natasha and Shannon. Thank you so much, Professor Hamraie. This is really an honor, and I'm so glad that you took time to speak with us. I want to just thank the students for the significant work that they have put into this effort. And I just want to recognize that, you know, these are first year students. And so immediately I kind of jumped in, you know, kind of saw a gap and jumped in, and I think have led a really important and collective effort within the institution and have done so much in a very short period of time. And so I just want to sort of acknowledge that labor and also say thank you to them, because they're giving us and the department a real gift of reflection, and it's kind of like the critique in its most generous and like loving form is this kind of critical dialogue. So I just really appreciate that. And Professor Hamraie, just super thrilled to have you here and taking time out of your busy schedule to talk with us. I've known about your work for several years and I'm an admirer and fan, so it's great to get a chance to hear about it in person. So the way that this will work is we'll hear from our guests for about the next 20 or so minutes around the topic of critical access studies. Then please, everybody, be thinking about questions. You can put the questions in the chat, or then you can just like save them and we'll have a time for questions afterwards where you can ask them directly. I will probably ask the first question, but then we're going to open it up for everyone. So yeah, so I think without further ado, the floor is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much for these wonderful introductions and for having me here. I'm going to share my slides. So my name is Aimi Hamraie, and I teach at Vanderbilt University in an interdisciplinary pre-med program that's based on the social determinants of health. And in that program, I teach disability studies. I also study histories of the built environment and accessibility. And I work in a field that is emerging called critical access studies, which is a field that is really pushing how we think about accessibility in the built environment beyond the Americans with Disabilities Act and related legal approaches to accessibility. Here on this slide, I'm showing an image from my archival research on the history of universal design, which I write about in my book, Building Access. And this image shows a photograph from the 1970s of the lobby of a business school. And there are two standing people and one person who's seated in a wheelchair. That's the architect Ron Mace, who is the founder of the Universal Design Movement. And on top of the image, Mace has basically drawn some lines to indicate what it would look like to create an accessible vestibule in this lobby. And to me, this image is a representation of the types of experiments that disabled people have done historically and in the present to really think about what makes space accessible, not in a standard and codified way necessarily, but as this sort of ongoing experiment. And so some of the ideas I'm going to talk about today are related to this. Just wait for the slide to change. Okay. So first I want to just give a little bit of background about the vocabulary of accessibility, the types of words and concepts that typically get used when we talk about this concept. You might hear terms like accommodations, barrier-free design, compliance, sometimes consumers or employment. These are spheres where accessibility typically takes place. The value of independence, practices such as retrofit, which is when you take an inaccessible space and you make it accessible. Often this is described in terms of the social model of disability, which is a concept from disability sociology that says that it's society that creates inaccessibility and inequality for disabled people, not something inherent to disabled bodies. And we also sometimes talk about universal design in terms of access, which is the idea that if you design things for disabled people, they can also be accessible for non-disabled people. And some of the images we might associate with access that I've included on this slide are of a curb cut that goes from the sidewalk to the street in the upper left-hand corner, an aluminum ramp on the right side there that goes up kind of like concrete incline. And then also I've included a page from an accessibility code as well that indicates the ideal slope of the ramp. And something that we can tell from these representations too is that often when we're talking about access in a kind of mainstream cultural way, we're talking about physical disability and wheelchair users, which is one very important and just one part of the broader kind of constellation of what could be included when we talk about accessibility. So I'm just waiting for the slides to change here. So the field of critical access studies has emerged in the last 10 or 15 years. And this is the best way to think about this is that people before critical access studies, and certainly this is still an important project, were very focused on convincing people who did not care about disability that they should care about disability. That's what a lot of the literature on accessibility tries to do. But then once, the ADA had passed and fields like disability studies emerged, and there was more of a critical mass of people who were convinced that accessibility was an important project, a number of critical concepts have started to emerge that are helping us think through the values underlying accessibility rather than taking accessibility for granted as a de facto good or as a kind of common sense. And so these concepts are kind of like the next wave of theory around accessibility, and they have important implications for built environments as well. So this slide shows a list of them, and I'm not going to go over all of them, but they include things like access intimacy, access fatigue, access washing, um, collective access. Some of you may be familiar with deaf space, which is a specific type of accessibility created by deaf architects. Disability dongle, which is a term that describes forms of accessibility that non-disabled people create that disabled people don't actually want, and radical access. And so some of these are I include this slide here to just show that there's a pretty big discourse about this that has emerged, and I'm going to talk about some of these specific concepts in more detail. Also to say, some of these concepts come from activism, some of them come from the humanities or social sciences, so they're not so like only coming from architects and urban designers as they were previously. So one important segment of critical access studies is crip theory. And the word crip is a reclamation of the term cripple, which is a pejorative term. In the 70s, disabled activists, specifically physically disabled people, started to reclaim this term. And what they meant by reclaiming it was that medical providers were using the word cripple pejoratively to say that there was something wrong with disabled people's bodies. But by reclaiming it, disabled people were also able to say, we don't have to abide by the norms that the medical field is setting out for what our functions should be and what kinds of work we ought to be able to do. And so from this has emerged a field of crypt theory, and there's a subset of this focused on technology and design that is different approaches to thinking about accessibility as something that isn't necessarily assimilating disabled people into mainstream society or making disabled people better able to do things that non-disabled people do, but actually creating a whole other kind of aesthetic and practical way of being. And so we have terms like cryptastic hacking. I've written about crypt technoscience and crypt mobility justice. And there are a number of others. And just as an example of this, the designer Sarah Hendren, who some of you may know, she's based in Boston, she did this great project called Engineering at Home, in which she documented with Katrin Lynch, who I believe is an anthropologist, the adaptations that one disabled woman had made to kind of do things around the home, in which she had basically rejected the medical prosthetics that were offered to her. So they weren't working for her. And she developed her own tools instead, even though they didn't make her look like she was quote unquote normal. And so one of those is this kind of silicone sleeve for an amputee that holds a fork, which is shown on this slide. So one of the primary areas of theorization in critical access studies is around the question of users and inhabitants. And this is where I've done a bunch of work, for example, showing the way that norms of the body have shaped design standards and parameters. On this slide, on the left hand, I'm showing two sculptures created by the sculptor Adam Belsky, where he used anthropometric data from soldiers and also housewives during the World War I era to create these kind of like eugenic ideal bodies, basically. And then these sculptures would be taken to the state fair and people would stand next to them, and whoever's body most closely approximated the norm would win a prize. And this was part of a cultural project of promoting a certain idea of what is beautiful and what is normal in American society. And this same data actually shaped design handbooks. And so on the right is the industrial designer Henry Dreyfuss created these materials called the design for man and woman that used that same data, and then kind of like drew these prototypical figures and then released the data for use by people who do product design and architectural design. And so this again is a kind of is sort of like the way that these numbers get translated into built environments and also normalize what kinds of people designers might think exist in the world. A similar thing happened actually with disabled users. So in the post-World War II era, researchers at the University of Illinois were collecting really similar data about disabled veterans and disabled housewives, shown on this slide, and then taking that and creating a kind of concept of a normal disabled user, what the prototypical disabled user might be. And this is actually why when we think about disability access, we focus so much on wheelchair users, because there's a lot of data about wheelchair users historically, but it also has this kind of cultural impact. It's not just that the data is scientific and exists out there. It shapes laws, it shapes how we talk about disability. And so here I'm showing the standards and codes that came as a result of that data, and also the ways that architectural handbooks took this data and translated it for architects, showing a kind of prototypical wheelchair user as disability itself. So accessibility isn't just about standards, though. It also has politics. And so I want to talk about this using some critical access concepts. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, when Congress was considering and then later passing the ADA, we had these representations of disability that were pretty limited in terms of law and in terms of design practice. But there were some people like manufacturers and disabled designers who are trying to change representations of who is disabled. And so here I'm showing some representations where they are trying to take race and gender into consideration. On the left is an advertisement for a drafting table that shows a young white woman, androgynous architecture student, and then on the right, a Black man architecture student who's a wheelchair user and has an afro, and they're using the same table. And the advertisement is kind of trying to make the argument that disability access benefits many types of people, but it's also showing disability in a much more expansive way than we were previously seeing. And similarly on the right, from some images from barrier-free design handbooks showing disabled people who are blind and also people of color and women. And so these are some challenges to the concept of the user that started to emerge. The universal design movement in the late 1990s also was trying to challenge the Americans with Disabilities Act. And here I'm showing a poster that has the principles of universal design. And what they were trying to do was to basically convince architects and other people that you should go beyond the code, that you should be thinking about usability and tolerance for error and how simple and intuitive something is to use rather than just obeying an accessibility checklist. One really interesting part of the politics of accessibility is economic access. And when I was researching my book, I visited this 7,000 square foot house outside of Columbus, Ohio, called the Universal Design Living Laboratory. Shown here, it's this kind of craftsman style suburban house. And this house showcases a variety of different accessibility technologies inside and markets them as forms of luxury. This is a very prevalent practice, but as a lot of people have explained, it also creates a lot of inequalities for disabled people who cannot afford this type of like luxurious home environment in order to have accessibility. A concept that I am thinking with now comes from the late disability activist Stacey Park Milburn. And this concept is access washing. And Stacey Park Milburn was a transformative justice activist and disability justice activist. And she was trying to get us to think about how the concept of accessibility, even though disabled people absolutely need access, sometimes the concept of accessibility gets used against certain disabled people, namely people who are unhoused. And so I'm showing an image of a tent city on a sidewalk here. And Stacey Milburn, in an article called Notes on Access Washing, wrote about how leveraging accessibility as justification to harm communities of color and poor and working class communities is a prevalent practice. And she asks, if accessibility is made at people's expense, we have to question and challenge that as access. Access for whom? And the specific example is city government implementing anti-homeless measures under the guise of making streets more accessible to people with disabilities, with no consideration that those most harmed by this, houseless community members, are often disabled people themselves. Another way that these kinds of critical concepts about accessibility show up in thinking about the urban environment is different forms of ableism that are coming up in, for example, attempts to promote health through the built environment. And this is something I'm writing a book about right now called Enlivened City. Here I'm showing a bicycle rack that's outside of my local public health department's building. And the bicycle rack shows these legs in motion, and the whole building itself is designed to promote exercise and movement. But the way that it gets talked about and the specific structures that are within and around this building and in the surrounding urban environment are very focused on actually eliminating disability rather than including it. And so those kinds of norms of the body are still showing up, even though there's nothing about this bicycle rack that is non-compliant with the ADA necessarily. It's sort of like the cultural discourse that it introduces that could be exclusionary. So I know that I just have a little bit more time, so I'm going to talk just very shortly about some alternative conceptions of access that come from disability culture. Disability culture is the term that we use to talk about basically what happens when disabled people get together and design things or have cultural spaces. One really important component of this is the disability justice movement, and some of its principles include intersectionality, anti-capitalism, sustainability, interdependence, and collective access. And a conception of access that this movement has introduced is the idea that access is love. So thinking about the design of public spaces, accessible public spaces, as a gesture of hospitality rather than something that is checking off a compliance checklist. One of the conferences that I go to frequently is the Society for Disability Studies. I'm showing an image of a conference plenary here where there's a lot of disability culture, and there are a lot of disabled people in the room. We can see power wheelchair users, there are ASL interpreters, there's transcription happening for everyone to look at on the right side. And all of these together are the kind of baseline or the norm for what access is like in many disability cultural spaces. And this is different than the approach that just accommodates people kind of individually or on a case-by-case basis. Here is an image of the Ed Roberts campus in Berkeley, California. This is a building that sits on top of a public transit station, and it houses the historic disability organizations in Berkeley. One of its most interesting design features is a ramp that is bright orange and winds around the interior of the lobby. And it's kind of flanked by these images of disability protests, and it's visible from the outside. And this building has many other accessibility features as well. But the reason I include this here is that it is very explicitly trying to show the presence of accessibility in the built environment rather than hide it. And that's kind of a critical access move. A lot of ADA compliance and other approaches to accessibility that are more rooted in accommodation are more about assimilation. And here is this kind of like showing the ramp, contextualizing it in terms of disability protests and historic movements. And then the last thing I'll just mention is the idea of methods and protocols for critical access. This is something that we work on in my lab, the Critical Design Lab. And the image I'm showing here is of a hand-drawn protocol from when we did a campus accessibility mapping project that led to basically a 40-year master planning process for accessibility on the Vanderbilt campus. And what we were trying to do was to introduce university administrators and people in our campus community to the idea that first of all, the campus was not actually accessible despite what everyone else was saying, but also that when we start to engage with the built environment, new critical questions come up for us that then we have to account for in our building standards and other things. And so the protocol shows the questions we're asking. First, we were looking for specific things like where can I find the accessible restrooms? And we went to Google Maps and other things. But the answers that we got were raising other questions. So we were starting to question like what counts as accessibility and for whom. And this kind of led to more and more questions. And then finally, we started to theorize together ideas about what it would mean for people who inhabit a space and don't really think about accessibility to be the ones who do the work to document the inaccessibility of that space and what would happen. And it produced a very kind of politicized process of thinking about accessibility that actually didn't just change how the university allocated resources towards this, but also the types of conversations that we could have and whose expertise was valued. So I have more examples of critical access protocols that I can talk about, but I'm going to stop here and just open it up for questions. And if anyone's interested, we can go back to some of those examples. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Fantastic. A lot in a short period of time. So I'll kick it off, but I would just really welcome folks to please put your questions in the chat, or else you can also raise your hand in Zoom and we can just call on you. We're a small group, relatively speaking. So yeah, Dr. Hamraie, one of the things that I really appreciate about your work is sort of what you're starting to show at the end around these various kinds of kind of concepts that have been brought into critical access studies, into thinking about disability and things like thinking about intersectionality and white supremacy and critical race theory, and kind of like drawing from a lot of these different fields to think about how different forms of oppression are intersecting when thinking about accessibility and access. And I saw like on your lab's website, you also have a very strong statement. We reject forms of accessibility rooted in anti-Blackness, settler colonialism, and white supremacy. And so I was just going to ask you, and you had the great example, I think, of the access washing too. So I feel like that's a really concrete example of how kind of these things get pitted against each other rather than being thought of together. But I'm wondering if you can elaborate a little bit more about how what we think of maybe these other forms of oppression other than ableism start to show up in mainstream thinking about accessibility, and how we can begin to see those, or like begin to take note of those, and sort of what to do about that, or how you navigate that in your own work.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. I think it's a really important one because, there's the sorts of things that in a kind of urban studies or urban planning context may be obvious from a social justice perspective are not always coming into conversations about accessibility. And so one of those things is like the inherent racialization of the street as a space or the sidewalk as a space, and what happens to pedestrians or other people who are using those spaces if they're perceived as not belonging there. So the access washing example of how encampments of unhoused people are treated is one example. But if we think about like the policing of public spaces, who is likely to get a ticket for sleeping outside in a bench is very racialized. It has to do with class perceptions. It has to do with gender. And so just like on a really basic level, there's no way that accessibility codes account for that at all. At the same time that those codes adopt very normative representations of what spaces are for. So for example, there are codes for bathrooms, and in the code, it'll tell you that the bathroom signs look like this, and they look like there's the male restroom and the female restroom, or the family restroom. And those distinctions and divisions are inherently rooted in a kind of like heterosexual and cisgender understanding of gender and sexuality, but they're just there without comment in the code. And they're offered as examples, but our ways of thinking about those spaces, not even just kind of like the gender binary, but what happens in the gender neutral or all gender restroom, are shifting. And so if someone is like a disabled person of color, who's using family and are judged as being outside of like the allowable use of that space, like there can be certain forms of policing and surveillance that happen around that. And if they are a trans person, even more so. And so these are the sorts of things that I think are just starting to be part of the conversation about accessibility. And they contrast with some of the approaches that people would take before, for example, to universal design, where they would try to say, oh, we should have an all gender restroom because disabled people and trans people can both use it. And that's a very kind of like liberal, multicultural sort of approach that's like one of you and one of you and one of you, and not taking into account that there are people who are both of those things and more, and like how someone inhabits that really shapes their experiences in public space. And then when we add in all of the sort of considerations of gentrification in cities and where certain types of amenities appear and don't appear, and who has access to, who gets to live in a place that has benches when they're walking around in their walkable community, who is deemed worthy of sitting on a bench, and who's like accused of loitering, like all of those things. Like there's basically no way to talk about any of this without taking an intersectional perspective. But unfortunately, that's how accessibility codes have tended to do things prior to this.
Thank you so much. I want to open it up. Anyone feel moved for a question or comment? Otherwise, I'll keep them, but. Okay.
There's one in the room, I think, Romy has.
Oh, good. Okay, great. Go
Hi.
for it.
Thank you so much for the really powerful presentation and just context. I'm really interested in how institutions implement design, both in like the structural infrastructure, but also thinking about shifting like system paradigms around thinking about accessibility. And just wanted to hear a little bit more, like especially being situated in a space like MIT that is like currently grappling with how to handle a lot of these design like approaches and initiatives. Like what are things for you that are like precedent to keep in mind as institutions are grappling with these decisions?
That's such a good question. This is something I have been thinking about a lot, really in my whole time as a professor. So I've been working at Vanderbilt for 9 years, and navigating institutions, especially universities, is very challenging because they are sort of, at the end of the day, very guided by economic decisions. And things like retrofits cost money, building new buildings cost money. And so I spent a bunch of time, at the same time that I was finishing my first book, I was doing a lot of institutional activism and just trying out the different strategies from the historical disability activists who I was studying at my university, and trying to see what would work. And the sorts of things that did not work so well were, like disabled students asking for access, because they were constantly told that no, everything's ADA accessible, and I don't know where that information was coming from, but it was something that was being said a lot. What did work was um, national attention being drawn to inaccessibility. So like a student wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post about his experiences navigating access. What did work was doing, we had these like mapathons for the Mapping Access Project, where, you know, hundreds of people would show up to map campus accessibility. But that also meant that a lot of people who were saying everything was accessible were seeing that everybody was going out and actually measuring things and studying the campus. And within like 2 months of doing that, the university was basically like, oh, we want to do our own accessibility mapping and have our own data. And then once they did that, they could no longer perpetuate the narrative that the campus was accessible, because I had data and they had data, and couldn't like ignore it anymore. And so the next time a master planning process came about, there's a whole accessibility master plan that was done for that. We rewrote the building code. It was kind of amazing, but it took like it was a critical access project. Like it took getting away from some of the ways of talking about accessibility that have historically been part of how we talk about the ADA, like, oh, we need things to be accessible so that disabled people can be good students or productive workers. Like we just kind of did away with all of that and kind of took a more aggressive and data-driven approach, because that in a way put more pressure on the institutional logics and ways of working than kind of trying to appeal to like, oh, you should recognize someone's humanity and their citizenship like that. We know that universities are, in general, are not propelled by that so much. So those are some of my thoughts about it. But of course, every institution is different. And so it is really about finding what the pressure point is at yours, I would say. And trying to, you know, like intervene in ways that can't be swept aside or ignored.
Thank you so much.
Mm.
I love that point. Including thinking about like what works to make change within institutional structures that are not set up to recognize humanity, let's say. I was wondering if you could, just to follow up on that, if you could talk a little bit more about the Mapping Access Project, because that was actually originally how I discovered your work. And I remember being really struck at the time around the expansive conception of accessibility that you are mapping, like again, departing from the notion of disability as people in wheelchairs and going to like this more expanded conception of like, what does it actually mean to map access? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, for sure. So when I started my job, as I was saying before, there was this notion that the campus was 100% accessible, and I was trying to think about what would it take to challenge that and who should be part of the conversation. And there were some map projects kind of on campus already in a way that offered opportunities for allyship. So for example, the Women's Center had a map of the lactation spaces on campus, and there are only 3. Like, I don't know why they made a map. They could have just listed them, but making the map was really effective in showing how few there were. The LGBT Center was starting to map the all gender restrooms and keep track of which ones were changing designation and stuff. And so we got together and we basically came up with a strategy of, we're not going to do an ADA accessibility audit. We're going to talk to our community about what it would mean to go beyond the ADA and make a survey instrument based on that. And in that instrument to like frame the questions in ways that whoever was gathering the data really would just start thinking about exercise of doing accessibility mapping. And that kind of became a whole method of like critical mapping, basically, like how to crowdsource data, but in the process, teach people to read the built environment in really critical ways, including people who never ever think about the built environment. So if anyone's interested in that, there's like a little toolkit on our lab website. I can drop the link in here that has some, classroom exercises or ways of doing this, like on a campus level. If anyone's using a screen reader, I'm about to put a link in the chat. But so it like that, yeah, that methodology can be used kind of like as an activist tool, I guess, is the main takeaway of all of that. I see that there's a
Awesome.
question. Oh,
Yeah, Natasha, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. I mean, in your work, you talk a lot about interdependence and how that challenges the dependence versus independence binary, I think, or complicates it rather. So could you talk about what interdependence could mean for planning, or what planning what interdependence can shape? Because we were trying to develop transportation teaching tools for our class for independent study, and we kind of struggled with that. So yeah.
That's such a good question. I mean, I think that like part of my answer, I think I need to say why like a lot of conceptions of disability rights are about destigmatizing dependence and promoting independence. And so the kind of figure of the independent, mobile citizen who's like moving through a transit system or going down the street without anyone else's help. And I think that, some of the really simple ways that that concept comes into friction with the lives of disabled people is that disabled people are not like unitary agents. Like we are in community with each other, but buildings and streets are not designed for like a group of people with different mobility needs or even like the same ones kind of like going down the street together, doing different things together. And so the types of interdependence that like designers and planners can think about supporting are really just like disability culture. Like what does it take to create public spaces where, many disabled people can be together rather than just for like tokenized and individualized disabled people who are usually thought of as like wheelchair users or power wheelchair users. I mean, there's really interesting stuff that you can look up from disabled artists on this, actually. Park MacArthur imagined like a disability kind of, those communities that are like live, work, play kinds of communities, but one that was based in disability culture. And she has this sort of like audio description of it. I think it was part of Whitney Biennial, describing what that kind of public space would look like and how people would be lounging by the pool together and helping each other do this and that, and how that was supported by the built environment. And then another form of interdependence that is more politicized comes from Shannon Finnegan, who's a disabled artist who does a lot of activism and art against stairs and against things that kind of produce fatigue. So they have like this project of like benches that say, this space has asked me to stand for too long, sit if you agree. And there's this kind of solidarity and sitting on the bench with somebody else. They also did a really cool project called the Anti-Stairs Club Lounge. In New York City, there's in whatever, I forget, like Hudson Yards, that like Google campus, there's a building called the Vessel that is comprised entirely of staircases. And it's this sort of Instagram fee opportunity sort of thing. But disability activists have, argued that the structure of the building is, inaccessible, but the building itself just represents this sort of like endurance-based physical ability kind of model of being in public space. And so Finnegan had this whole public protest. It was like an art project, public protest, where people came to the vessel and they signed a pledge that said, as long as I live, I will never climb the stairs of the vessel. And it was an interdependence and solidarity project where they instead created these kind of like makeshift hangout spots down at the bottom of the vessel where they protested the vessel at the same time. And it was this kind of like guerrilla public art sort of thing. So I think like some of the spirit of that can be a model for thinking about interdependence and disability culture. And I know that like planning is not the same as artist practice, but I think that there are things that disabled artists are doing that could be really informative for planners.
Thank you for that.
Wonderful. Well, I realize we're at time, and so maybe as a way to carry us out, Dr. Hamraie, maybe you want to just tell us about your podcast, just in case people here want to follow it. I just as a note, like I went prior to this event and looked at all the past episodes, and there's just like amazing guests and really interesting people. So that's my quick plug. Why don't you tell us more about it?
Thank you. Yeah, so Contra is a podcast about disability and design justice. And in the previous seasons, we focused on technology and also on mutual aid and solidarity. And actually right now we're producing a whole season on critical access studies. So that will start to come out in the next few months. And it basically comprises different members of the Critical Design Lab engaging with critical access theories, and then all of us having conversations about it. And all the episodes have transcriptions and show notes and links and all that kind of stuff. So you can engage with them in different formats.
Amazing. I just put the link in the chat. So maybe everyone just join me in a big round of applause, silent or not. Oh, good. There's some real sounds. I could hear them. Yeah. And Natasha and Shannon, I don't know if you want to say anything else from here.
Just a big thank you to our speaker today, to Catherine also for facilitating, and to everyone who's been a part of the Independence Study, to Delia and Mariana's both for this creating space for this entire semester. So thank you.
Thanks so much for having me, and sorry again about the time mix up. It was really great to be here with you all.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you. All right, everyone. Have a great day.
Nice to see you, Catherine.
Hi, Garnet. Hi, Garnet, through the internet.
I'm going to steal those flowers if I'm ever in your neighborhood. I like the background, those flowers.
Thank you. Garnet, are you on campus?
Yes.